The lawyer's office smelled faintly of dust and polished with the kind of room designed for quiet conversations and heavier truths. My brother sat across from me, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who already believed he knew the outcome. When Mr. Ellis cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, I folded my hands in my lap. I wasn't expecting surprises. Our parents had always been predictable in their affection, if not in their approval. The family residence, he began carefully, is to be transferred in full ownership to your daughter Mara. For a moment I thought I'd misheard. To Mara, he repeated. The room didn't react immediately. It went still. Not confused. Not emotional. Just suspended. Then my brother laughed. A short, sharp sound that bounced off the bookshelves. That's not right, he said. They meant joint ownership. Mr. Ellis shook his head. The language is very clear. My brother's smile thinned. He leaned forward, scanning the page himself as if proximity would change the ink. They wouldn't do that, he muttered. I felt everyone's eyes shift toward me. My aunt, the cousin who had come for support, even the assistant by the door. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't even considered it. I remember thinking the silence would pass quickly, that we would clarify something procedural and move on. I didn't realize then how important that silence would become. The truth is, I didn't need the house. By the time our parents passed, I had built a life that didn't depend on inheritance or approval. I worked as a compliance director for a mid-sized financial firm, steady, structured work that rewarded attention to detail and long memory. I owned my condo outright. My retirement accounts were balanced, my emergency fund intact. I lived quietly and comfortably. No one ever threw a barbecue for my promotions. When I paid off my mortgage at 39, I did it alone at my kitchen table with a wire transfer and a glass of water. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post about it. I just closed my laptop and went back to work. Stability had become my habit. The house, though, wasn't about money. It was the pale blue two-story where we grew up. The kitchen where my mother hummed while cooking. The hallway with the faint scuff mark from when my brother threw a baseball inside and blamed me for not catching it. It carried history, not profit. My brother Daniel saw it differently. Daniel had always moved through life with acceleration but without brakes. Credit cards opened enthusiastically, then ignored. Business ideas that sparkled brightly for 6 months before dissolving into debt. A restaurant partnership that ended in litigation. A condo he sold at a loss after refinancing it twice. Our parents had helped him more than once. Quiet loans. Co-signed agreements. Bailouts framed as temporary bridges. I was the bridge that didn't need reinforcing. If anything, I had assumed the house would go to him precisely because he needed it more. That was the family pattern. He required support. I required understanding. That should have been my first clue. Need and entitlement often look similar from the outside. When Mr. Ellis announced that the house was mine alone, I felt no triumph. Just confusion layered over something steadier. Responsibility. I knew what property taxes cost. I knew what maintenance required. I knew that keeping that house would mean preserving more than walls. Daniel knew market value. He was already calculating what it could sell for. I could see it in his posture at the wheel, reading, shoulders tense, jaw tight, not with grief but with arithmetic. I had built my life without their applause. What I didn't know yet was that they had been watching anyway. Daniel was always the louder story. From the time we were children, he filled rooms with ease. Teachers described him as charismatic. Neighbors called him such a character. At family gatherings, he told exaggerated stories and had everyone laughing before dessert. I was the one who helped clear the plates. If Daniel forgot homework, my mother would sigh and say, "He just needs more help staying organized." If I forgot something, it was framed as unusual, almost disappointing. "That's not like you," she'd say, which sounded like praise but felt like pressure. He was forgiven quickly. I was expected to anticipate. When he broke a window playing baseball too close to the house, my father asked why I hadn't stopped him. When he spent his allowance in one afternoon, my mother handed him mine, just this once. I learned early that stability could be redistributed. "He just needs more help," became the refrain. More help with school. More help with money. More help with discipline. The phrase carried warmth when directed at him. When applied to me, it shifted into expectation. "You're stronger," my mother would say. "You understand." Understanding meant adjusting. It meant absorbing small injustices because they were easier than conflict. In high school, Daniel failed algebra twice. Our parents hired a tutor and rearranged schedules to support him. When I won a regional essay competition, my father nodded approvingly and asked whether Daniel's grades had improved. It wasn't cruelty. It was prioritization. There's a difference. Daniel's needs were urgent and visible. Mine were internal and therefore optional. I don't remember feeling jealous of him. I remember feeling invisible beside him. The dependable one. The backup plan. The quiet insurance policy against his volatility. If he came home late, they stayed up worrying. If I came home late, they assumed I had a reason. That was the compliment. I was trusted to manage myself. Over time, I began managing everything else too. Reminding him of deadlines. Reviewing contracts when he launched his first small business. Translating financial statements he barely glanced at. I told myself I was being supportive. Looking back, I see the pattern more clearly. He was the project. I was the foundation. Foundations don't get celebrated. They get built upon. Even as adults, the dynamic barely shifted. When Daniel lost money in a failed venture, my parents described him as unlucky. When I questioned the risk, I was described as rigid. "You're too cautious," my brother once said, half joking. Caution paid my mortgage. Impulse emptied his savings. But impulse was interesting. Caution was ordinary. Then and now feel sharply divided in my memory. Then I equated love with usefulness. If I was steady enough, reliable enough, perhaps the comparison would disappear. Perhaps they would notice the weight I carried quietly. Now I understand something I didn't then. Being overlooked does not mean being lesser. It means the spotlight was pointed elsewhere. When the will was read and the house was named as mine, it wasn't just property shifting hands. It was a reversal of an old script. For years, Daniel had been centered because he demanded attention. I had remained peripheral because I didn't. That should have been my first clue that the story might not end the way he expected. Back then I was the quiet fixer. Now I was something else. Self-defined. And self-defined people are harder to displace. In the last 3 years of their lives, the rhythm changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would have announced. But gradually the phone calls shifted direction. My mother began calling me about insurance forms, property tax notices, prescription refills. "Can you look at this?" became a weekly refrain. I drove over on Saturdays to sort through paperwork spread across the dining room table. Daniel lived 40 minutes farther away than I did, but distance had never really been the issue. He visited when it suited him. Birthday dinners, holidays, occasional drop-ins that left my parents glowing for days afterward. But when the furnace failed in February or the roof needed inspecting, it was me who scheduled contractors. "You're just better at this," my father would say, handing me a folder of bills. Better at this. I never asked whether Daniel had been called first. I assumed he had. There were small moments that felt like adjustments in gravity. My father asking for my opinion on refinancing options. My mother quietly mentioning that Daniel had borrowed against his condo again. A tense conversation I overheard between them about protecting the house. Protecting it from what I didn't know. One afternoon, while I was helping my mother organize old documents, she paused over a manila envelope labeled estate. "You don't need to worry about that yet," she said, lightly sliding it into a drawer. I remember thinking the comment was unnecessary. I hadn't asked. That should have been my first clue. In their final year, my father's health declined quickly. Hospital visits multiplied. I coordinated with specialists, tracked medications, updated spreadsheets of appointments. Daniel came when he could, but his visits were sporadic and often brief. "He's busy," my mother would say defensively, even when I hadn't commented. Busy had always been a shield. One evening after a long day at the hospital, my father sat quietly in his armchair while I adjusted the thermostat. "You always show up," he said suddenly. I glanced at him, unsure whether he was reflecting or apologizing. "I try," I replied. He nodded as if confirming something privately. A month later, Mr. Ellis's business card appeared on the kitchen counter. I didn't ask questions. I told myself estate planning was routine at their age. Practical. Responsible. But beneath that logic, something else stirred. Not expectation. Just awareness. Patterns were shifting. Conversations were happening without Daniel in the room. Decisions were being framed as preservation rather than assumption. I didn't realize then how carefully they were observing both of us. I was busy handling logistics. Daniel was busy handling his own crises. By the time the house became part of a legal document, the emotional calculus had already been done. I just hadn't been invited to witness it. The first accusation didn't sound like one. "I just don't understand how this happened," Daniel said in the parking lot, after the will reading, shaking his head as if genuinely confused. "You must have known something." I stared at him, trying to parse whether he was joking. "I didn't," I said calmly. He gave a thin smile. "Come on. You were handling their paperwork." There it was. Handling paperwork had become strategy. Within 48 hours the narrative began circulating. My cousin texted, "Heard there was a surprise in the will. Hope everything's fair." My aunt called, her voice wrapped in concern. "Your brother seems blindsided," she said. "You didn't pressure them, did you?" Pressure. The word traveled quickly. I answered each question evenly. "No. I didn't know. But repetition has weight." At the first family dinner after the reading, scheduled originally as a memorial gathering, the atmosphere felt altered. People were polite, but their politeness had edges. Daniel arrived late as usual, but this time he carried something heavier than impatience. "I've been thinking," he said during dessert, loud enough for the table to hear. "Mom and Dad wouldn't have done this without influence." My fork paused midair. "What are you implying?" I asked. He shrugged as if reluctant to say it plainly. "You were there all the time. Handling documents. Talking to lawyers." "I was coordinating medical appointments," I replied. "Not drafting wills." A few relatives avoided eye contact. My aunt cleared her throat. "It's just unusual," she murmured. "The house always felt like it would go to Daniel." Felt. As if expectation itself were entitlement. Over the next week the micro-accusations multiplied. "You were always closer to them in the end," one cousin said. "Maybe they felt guilty." "Guilty for what?" "Daniel doesn't have the same stability you do," another relative offered gently. "This hurts him more." Hurts him more. As if inheritance were an emotional subsidy. Daniel's tone shifted from confusion to wounded righteousness. He began framing himself as the displaced son. "They trusted me with memories," he told a family friend within earshot of me. "But apparently paperwork mattered more." Paperwork. The irony didn't escape me. I began noticing how often conversations paused when I entered rooms. How quickly voices lowered. How sympathy gathered around him in small performative gestures. He never accused me outright of manipulation. He didn't need to. Suggestion did the work. "She's always been strategic," he told our uncle once, glancing at me. "Very detail-oriented." Detail-oriented. What had once been a compliment was now evidence. At another gathering he said quietly but audibly, "It's not about the money. It's about fairness." Fairness. I found myself explaining the same thing repeatedly. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't expect this. I wasn't even sure I wanted this." But defensiveness reads like guilt when people are looking for confirmation. That should have been my second clue. Guilt campaigns don't begin with shouting. They begin with implication. "You're in a better position than he is," my aunt told me privately. "Maybe you could consider sharing." Sharing. The house had become negotiable in everyone's mind except mine. What unsettled me most wasn't Daniel's anger. It was how quickly the family defaulted to protecting him again. The golden son reframed as victim. At one dinner he finally said it directly. "You could fix this," he said, looking straight at me. "You could transfer half." The room quieted. There it was. Not a question. A correction. I felt the familiar pull to smooth it over. To say something conciliatory. To avoid fracture. For years that instinct had kept peace. But peace built on assumption is fragile. "I didn't create this situation," I replied evenly. "Mom and Dad made a decision. They were vulnerable," he shot back. "And you weren't." I asked softly. The silence that followed was different from the one in the lawyer's office. This one carried accusation and anticipation. Micro-accusations had stacked long enough to form a structure. I could feel it solidifying around me. What I didn't realize yet was that the foundation of that structure was thinner than Daniel believed. And what happened next would change everything. 3 days after the memorial dinner, Mr. Ellis called. "There's something I should have given you at the reading," he said. "Your parents requested it be delivered privately." Privately. When I arrived at his office, he handed me a sealed envelope thicker than I expected. My mother's handwriting curved across the front. "For Mara," it read. My hands felt steadier than I thought they would as I opened it. The first page was in my father's careful script. "If you are reading this," he began, "it means we are no longer here to explain our reasoning ourselves." I paused there longer than necessary. "We know this decision may surprise you," the letter continued. "It may even cause tension." May. My mother's handwriting joined halfway through, slightly slanted. "The house is not about favoritism. It is about preservation." Preservation. They wrote about the last few years. About who had managed repairs when the roof leaked. Who had sat through medical consultations. Who had kept track of mortgage statements and insurance renewals. "We watched how you handled responsibility," my father wrote. Not loudly. Not for praise. The next paragraph was gentler but sharper. "Your brother has struggled with debt. We have assisted him more times than we can count. We do not regret helping him. But we cannot risk the house being leveraged or sold impulsively." I exhaled slowly. They knew. They had known about the refinancing. The loans. The short-term business partnerships Daniel insisted would turn around. "We want the house to remain intact," my mother wrote. "Not divided. Not negotiated. Not used as collateral." There was no accusation in their tone. No resentment toward him. Just clarity. At some point, my father added, "We realize that fairness does not always mean equal division. Sometimes it means appropriate trust." Appropriate trust. I read that sentence twice. Then I reached the final paragraph. "You have always shown up," they wrote. "Not because you needed to, but because you chose to. This is not repayment. It is acknowledgement." Acknowledgement. The word settled somewhere deeper than relief. For weeks I had questioned myself in quiet moments. Wondered if perhaps I had unknowingly influenced them. If my proximity had blurred lines. But the letter dismantled that doubt. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't oversight. It was deliberation. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. I folded the pages, carefully smoothing the creases before placing them back into the envelope. The guilt that had hovered at the edges of my thoughts receded. In its place was something steadier. Intention. My parents had seen the dynamic clearly enough to alter it. They hadn't chosen me out of preference. They had chosen stability over risk. Outside the lawyer's office, the air felt colder than it had that morning. Daniel was still telling people I had maneuvered behind the scenes. What he didn't know was that our parents had maneuvered quietly themselves. And now I had proof. I didn't call Daniel after reading the letter. I didn't text my aunt or forward copies to cousins who had been whispering. For years I would have tried to correct the narrative immediately, as if urgency could outrun assumption. This time I chose sequence. First I met with Mr. Ellis again and confirmed the transfer timeline. Title paperwork. Tax implications. Insurance updates. I made sure every document reflected exactly what my parents had intended. Clarity, I had learned, begins with structure. Then I scheduled a meeting with my financial advisor. Not because I planned to sell the house, but because I wanted contingency plans outlined. Rental options. Trust structures. Preservation strategies. If Daniel tried to escalate legally, I wanted preparedness to replace panic. During those conversations, I kept my tone neutral. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was stewardship. The more grounded I became in the practicalities, the less reactive I felt toward the accusations swirling around me. I also reread the letter twice more. Not for sentiment, but for language. Words like preservation, appropriate trust, acknowledgement. They mattered. When my aunt called again to check in, I didn't defend myself. I simply said, "There are details you're not aware of. I'll explain them soon." Soon. I decided the next conversation would not happen in a parking lot or over whispered side comments. It would happen publicly, calmly, with everyone present who had felt comfortable speculating. I hosted a dinner 2 weeks later at the house. Daniel arrived stiffly, clearly expecting confrontation. Relatives came cautiously, curiosity barely disguised as politeness. I didn't greet anyone with tension. I poured drinks. I asked about work. I let conversation settle before shifting. Emotional restraint has its own gravity. It forces others to adjust. By the time dessert was served, the air in the room felt different, less charged, more attentive. I had secured the title. I had secured my footing. Now I was ready to secure the narrative. It didn't take long. We had barely cleared the plates when Daniel set his glass down with deliberate force. "I think we should address the obvious," he said, glancing around the table as if inviting witnesses. The room tightened instantly. "What obvious?" I asked evenly. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "The house. You know this isn't what Mom and Dad would have wanted long-term." Several relatives shifted in their chairs. My aunt folded her napkin carefully, avoiding eye contact. "I think," Daniel continued, "the right thing to do would be to split it. Transfer half. Make it fair." Fair. The word felt rehearsed. "This doesn't have to be complicated," he added, voice smooth but edged. "You're in a better financial position. You don't need all of it." Need again. I noticed how he framed it, not as entitlement but as morality. Doing the right thing. Preserving harmony. Avoiding conflict. What he was asking for wasn't private negotiation. It was public compliance. I could feel the room watching me, measuring my response. If I resisted, I would confirm suspicion. If I agreed, I would confirm weakness. "You're really going to keep it?" he pressed. "After everything?" After everything. The implication hung heavily. I took a slow sip of water before answering. "Are you asking," I said calmly, "or are you instructing?" A faint flush rose to his cheeks. "I'm asking you to think about the family," he replied. I looked around the table deliberately. I said. And then I reached for the envelope I had placed beside my chair. I unfolded the letter, carefully smoothing the paper as if the gesture itself required patience. "I wasn't planning to share this," I said, looking around the table. "But since fairness is being discussed, context matters." Daniel shifted in his chair. "This is from Mom and Dad," I continued. "They asked that I read it privately. I think tonight qualifies." I began with my father's handwriting. "The house is not about favoritism. It is about preservation." The room went quiet. "They wrote that they wanted it to remain intact," I said, meeting my aunt's gaze briefly. "Not divided. Not negotiated. Not leveraged." Daniel inhaled sharply. "That doesn't mean." I raised a hand slightly. Not to silence him aggressively. Just to finish. "They also wrote," I continued. "We have assisted your brother more times than we can count. We do not regret helping him. But we cannot risk the house being used as collateral." The word collateral seemed to echo louder than the rest. A cousin glanced at Daniel, surprise flickering across his face. I lowered the page slightly. They were aware of the refinancing. The short-term loans. The business ventures that didn't stabilize. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant." "It is," I replied calmly. "Because this wasn't about who needed it more. It was about who would protect it." I resumed reading. "Fairness does not always mean equal division. Sometimes it means appropriate trust." Appropriate trust. I let the sentence settle fully before folding the letter halfway. "I didn't ask for this," I said evenly. "I didn't influence it. I didn't negotiate it. It was entrusted." Entrusted. The word shifted the center of gravity in the room. For weeks I had been defending myself against implication. Now I wasn't defending. I was presenting. "They watched who handled repairs," I continued. "Who managed appointments. Who kept records. That mattered to them." Daniel looked around the table as if searching for reinforcement. "So I'm just irresponsible now?" he snapped. "I didn't say that," I replied. "They did." Silence. The difference was subtle but decisive. I wasn't attacking him. I was quoting them. "They helped you many times," I added gently. "And they didn't resent that. But they made a different decision about this." My aunt cleared her throat softly. "They wrote that?" she asked. "Yes." I placed the letter in the center of the table. "You're welcome to read it." Daniel didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms in a posture that felt suddenly defensive rather than assertive. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't the manipulative sister hoarding inheritance. I was the custodian of a deliberate choice. They trusted me to preserve it, I said quietly. Not to prove something. Not to compete. To preserve. No one spoke for several seconds. What had begun as a demand for moral correction had become a confrontation with documented intent. Daniel's certainty faltered visibly. His earlier confidence that the family would pressure me into compliance no longer had the same footing. I folded my hands on the table. I won't apologize for honoring their decision, I said calmly. The room didn't erupt. It didn't fracture. It recalibrated. And that shift was enough. I looked at Daniel, then at the rest of the table. I understand that this hurts, I said calmly. But hurt doesn't make something unjust. No one interrupted. Mom and Dad made a deliberate decision, I continued. Not impulsively. Not under pressure. And I will honor it. Daniel's eyes flickered with frustration. I won't transfer the house, I said plainly. Not because I need it more. Not because I want to win. But because it was entrusted to me. Entrusted. I won't surrender to guilt for carrying out their wishes, I added. If we're going to talk about fairness, then fairness includes respecting their judgment. The air in the room felt steadier now. I'm open to maintaining relationships, I said softly. But not at the cost of undoing what they carefully chose. There was no anger in my voice. Just clarity. Then I reached for my glass and let the conversation move on without apology, without retreat. Daniel left early that night. He didn't slam the door. He didn't argue further. He simply gathered his coat and said, "I need some air," in a tone that suggested the air inside had shifted against him. For several weeks after he didn't call, the silence felt different this time, not like tension waiting to erupt but like recalculation. When he did reach out, it was brief and transactional. A forwarded bill that still had my name on it from before the transfer. A question about retrieving old photo albums from the attic. There were no more public accusations. Extended family adjusted quietly. My aunt stopped saying the situation was unfortunate and began referring to it as their decision. Cousins who had once asked whether I planned to share started asking about renovation plans instead. Reputation shifts slowly, but it does shift. The house felt different once the tension settled. For weeks I had walked through it as if it were a courtroom exhibit, aware of judgment, aware of eyes. Then gradually it became home again. I replaced the worn carpet in the hallway but left the scuff mark on the wall untouched. I updated the plumbing and repainted the kitchen, but kept my mother's old spice rack exactly where she had mounted it. Preservation, not possession. On quiet evenings I sat on the back porch and thought about how close I had come to surrendering it just to restore comfort. How easy it would have been to split the deed and avoid confrontation. That should have been my final clue. Peace built on appeasement isn't peace. It's delay. Daniel eventually moved to another state following what he described as a fresh start. We speak occasionally and carefully, politely. The sharpness between us dulled over time, though it never fully disappeared. What changed most wasn't him. It was me. The anxiety that had followed the will, reading the sense that I needed to justify my existence in that house, faded. I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head, stopped anticipating accusation in every family text. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like continuity. My parents had trusted me with something tangible. Not because I was louder. Not because I was favored. Because I was steady. And steadiness, once recognized, no longer requires apology. For a while I thought inheriting the house meant winning something. Then I thought it meant losing something. Now I understand it meant neither. It wasn't a prize. It wasn't a statement against my brother. It wasn't proof that I had finally stepped out of his shadow. It was responsibility. My parents didn't leave me the house because they loved me more. They left it because they believed I would protect it, preserve it, carry it forward without turning it into leverage. Favoritism is loud and emotional. Trust is quiet and practical. For years I confused being overlooked with being undervalued. I thought worth had to be announced, defended, compared. Doesn't. Worth is demonstrated in consistency, in showing up, in making decisions that outlast resentment. I didn't choose this inheritance, but I chose how to hold it. And the moment I stopped negotiating my right to what was entrusted to me, I stopped standing in anyone's shadow. My value was never something to be debated across a dinner table. It was already built into the foundation.